The storm outside seemed to intensify as Jack stood frozen in place, contemplating the decision before him. The German shepherd's eyes locked with his, her breath heavy with anxiety and cold. The tiny pups, nestled in the snow, trembled beneath her. The stillness in the air was palpable, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire and the howling wind outside. Jack's heart raced, torn between the fear of opening the door and the undeniable need to help. He could see the desperation in the dog's eyes. This wasn't just an ordinary stray. This was a mother in survival mode. Her protective stance over the puppies was both a testament to her loyalty and a sign of how dire the situation had become. The storm was relentless, and if he didn't act, the consequences would be unimaginable. For a moment, Jack hesitated. He had lived alone in the cabin for years, choosing isolation over the hustle and bustle of the world outside. He was no stranger to solitude, but there was something about the German shepherd and her pups that awakened a protective instinct in him. He knew that opening the door might bring trouble, but not opening it could be worse. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his fingers twitching as the cold from outside seeped in through the cracks of the doorframe. The howling wind was deafening, but it only served to emphasize the quiet urgency of the situation. He could hear the faint whimpers of the puppies now, their tiny bodies barely visible beneath their mother's coat. His chest tightened as he realized just how fragile their existence was. Time was running out. Jack exhaled sharply and made his decision. With a steady hand, he unlocked the door and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened, allowing a rush of icy air to flood the cabin. The dog flinched at the sudden burst of wind but didn't move, still guarding her pups. Jack stepped forward, cautiously, his eyes never leaving the dog's. The shepherd let out a low growl, warning him to stay back, but Jack wasn't deterred. He spoke softly, trying to calm her. "It's all right," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it. The dog's eyes flickered between his face and the pups, her growl softening into a whine. Jack stepped closer, crouching down to the dog's level. He could feel the intense cold now, the snow seeping into his boots and biting at his skin. His breath came out in clouds of vapor, but he didn't care. The moment was too important. The shepherd's ears twitched as he extended his hand towards her, palm open in a gesture of peace. She didn't move at first, but after a tense moment, she shifted slightly, allowing him to touch her fur. He was taken aback by how cold she was, her coat matted with ice and snow. He could feel her ribs pressing against his hand, the stark contrast between her frailty and her fierce determination striking him deeply. Her body trembled beneath his touch, and Jack realized just how close she was to giving up. He knew he couldn't leave her out there. He had to bring her and the pups inside, even if it meant facing the unknown. "Come on," Jack said softly, urging her to move. "Let's get you inside." With a reluctant whine, the German shepherd slowly stepped forward, nudging the tiny pups with her nose. Jack bent down to scoop them up, careful not to jostle them too much. Their small, fragile bodies were barely warm, and Jack's heart ached as he cradled them in his arms. The pups were silent now, their small bodies limp against his chest. The snowstorm outside raged on, but Jack wasn't concerned with that. His focus was solely on the dog and her puppies. He gently nudged her to follow him inside, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. As Jack stepped back into the cabin, he felt a sense of urgency, as though time was slipping away faster than he could act. He closed the door behind him, sealing out the storm, and turned to face the shepherd. She was standing in the doorway, eyes locked on the puppies in his arms, her body tense with apprehension. Jack didn't wait for her to make the next move. He placed the pups down on the soft rug near the fireplace, where the heat from the fire would help them warm up. The shepherd watched intently, her eyes flicking between the puppies and Jack. She didn't approach immediately, still unsure of this strange human who had taken her pups inside. But Jack wasn't worried. He knew the bond between mother and child was strong, and once she saw her pups safe and sound, her trust in him would grow. He turned to the fire and added a few more logs, the flames crackling to life. The warmth from the fire spread throughout the room, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The German shepherd took a tentative step towards the pups, sniffing the air. She hesitated for a moment before moving closer, her body still trembling from the cold. Jack stood back, allowing her the space she needed, but he couldn't help but watch as she curled her body around her pups, shielding them from the harsh realities of the outside world. Her tail, once tucked between her legs, began to relax, and her body language softened. She nuzzled her pups gently, and Jack could see the relief in her eyes as the warmth from the fire began to work its magic. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just the three of them in that cabin, safe from the storm. But Jack knew their journey wasn't over yet. He had made the decision to open the door, to bring them inside, but now he had to figure out how to care for them. The German shepherd was clearly malnourished, and her pups were too small to survive the storm without help. Jack took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He would need to get them medical attention, food, and warmth. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him, but there was something in his gut telling him this was the right thing to do. He reached for the phone on the counter, dialing the number for the nearest animal shelter. The phone rang several times before a voice on the other end answered. Jack explained the situation as quickly as he could, his voice steady despite the turmoil he was feeling inside. He had to act fast, and he knew the shelter could help. As he hung up the phone, Jack turned back to the German shepherd and her pups. They were still curled up by the fire, the shepherd's eyes now soft with trust. Jack knew he had made the right choice. He had opened the door to them, and now they were safe. But as he looked at the tiny pups, barely clinging to life, a new sense of determination filled him. The storm outside might rage on, but inside, in that small cabin, Jack had a family to protect. And he would do whatever it took to make sure they were safe, no matter the cost. As the storm howled louder outside, Jack stood there, his hand still hovering over the door handle. His instincts told him to stay inside, to maintain the safety of his cabin. He had seen enough of the harsh winter seasons to know the dangers that lurked beyond the cabin's walls. A wild animal could be a threat. The cold could kill in minutes. But then, there was something in the German shepherd's eyes, something raw and desperate. The way she pressed her body so protectively against her pups showed that she wasn't just another stray looking for food. She was a mother fighting to keep her children alive. Jack's breath fogged up the glass as he stood frozen, weighing the decision before him. His gaze flickered back to the puppies, now shaking violently, their tiny bodies barely visible beneath their mother's protection. They looked so fragile, so helpless in the face of the storm. They needed warmth, shelter, safety. But by opening the door, Jack was stepping into the unknown. There was no guarantee that taking them in would end well, that they weren't carrying some disease, or that their mother wasn't hiding some other, more dangerous intentions. As the wind howled louder and the temperature dropped further, Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could leave them out there and simply return to his peaceful, solitary life, or he could do something uncharacteristic for him. Something that would require him to act on impulse, on his instincts, rather than on careful thought. He had never been a man to take chances, yet something in the eyes of the German shepherd made him hesitate. The last time he had allowed himself to take a chance had been years ago, when he had fought fires with no regard for his own safety. But that was before his retirement. That was before he had decided to step away from risk and live a quiet life, far from the chaos of his past. Now, standing in front of the door, Jack made a decision that would shift his world. He grabbed the door handle and twisted. The door creaked open slowly, the bitter cold of the outside air rushing in. The German shepherd lifted her head slightly, her ears alert, her body tense as though unsure whether to trust this man or flee. Her eyes locked with his again, and Jack saw that they were full of pain and fear, but there was also a glimmer of hope. She knew she couldn't survive alone in the storm, and she was trusting him to do something about it. "Easy now," Jack murmured softly, as if speaking to a nervous animal, though he knew the gravity of the moment. He extended his hand toward the dog, slowly. The shepherd didn't move, but she didn't back away either. She remained crouched, keeping her pups pressed against her, as if the cold could not touch them as long as she shielded them with her own body. Jack stepped forward cautiously, not wanting to startle her. The last thing he needed was for her to panic and flee. But something about the stillness in her demeanor told him that she trusted him, at least for the moment. He took another step, then knelt down, keeping himself at her level. His eyes were on the pups, small, trembling creatures who were completely unaware of the peril they were in. The snow continued to pile up around them, and the temperature seemed to drop another degree with every passing moment. Jack could feel the chill biting through his jacket, but he ignored it. He was focused on the task at hand now. Without thinking, He slowly extended his arms to carefully lift one of the pups. The shepherd growled low in her throat, a warning. Jack froze, and the growl softened into a low whine. She wasn't trying to scare him away, but she was making sure that he understood the gravity of the situation. Her pups were her world. She would protect them with everything she had. "It's okay, girl," Jack said softly, not moving his arms. "I'm not going to hurt them. I just want to help." Slowly, he adjusted his position and slid his hand beneath the trembling body of one of the pups. The small dog whimpered, but didn't resist as Jack gently lifted it into his arms. He could feel its tiny heartbeat racing in his palms, and its body was like ice. A sense of urgency surged through him. He needed to get them inside, out of the cold. Jack carefully looked at the shepherd, who had relaxed slightly but still stood protectively over the other pup. She was clearly exhausted, but there was no hesitation in her eyes now. Jack could see that she knew she had made the right choice in seeking his help. The moment of trust passed between them, an unspoken understanding that they were in this together. "I've got you," Jack whispered again, his voice full of determination. He gently placed the first pup in his coat, wrapping it carefully in the warmth of his wool jacket. Then he turned his attention to the second. Without hesitation, Jack moved to the second pup and scooped it into his arms with the same careful tenderness. The mother dog watched intently, her body still tense but no longer growling. She was trusting him completely. Once the pups were secured in his coat, Jack carefully rose to his feet. His heart pounded as he moved slowly and deliberately, trying to keep both the dog and the pups calm. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, shutting out the vicious storm. For a moment, Jack just stood there, breathing heavily, his senses overwhelmed by the cold air inside and the warmth of the cabin. The transformation was instantaneous. Outside was chaos, but inside there was calm. But Jack knew it wouldn't last long. He needed to get them settled quickly, get them out of the elements before they froze. He moved toward the fireplace, his boots crunching on the wood floor. The shepherd followed closely behind, her movements now more hesitant, though still driven by a protective instinct. She didn't move away from the pups as Jack gently laid them down in front of the fire. He was no veterinarian, but he knew enough to try and warm the pups as quickly as possible. Jack didn't know why he had made the decision to help, why he had opened the door in the first place. But now that he had, he couldn't back down. The pups were counting on him. The mother dog was counting on him. And for the first time in years, Jack had the distinct feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. As the warmth of the fire began to seep into the room, Jack took a moment to look at the dog and her pups. The shepherd's eyes were still focused on her children, but she was no longer shaking from the cold. She sat back on her haunches, her breathing slowing. For the first time since Jack had opened the door, she seemed to relax, if only just a little. Jack wasn't sure how he would care for them all, but he knew that he had made the right choice in letting them in. The fire crackled as the snowstorm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin there was a stillness that felt almost sacred. Jack knew that things were about to change in a way he hadn't anticipated. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt something stirring deep within him, something that had been dormant for far too long. The warmth of the fire began to fill the cabin, and for a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to exhale. He watched the German shepherd as she lay down beside her puppies, keeping them close, her body curled protectively around them. They had survived the storm outside, but the battle for their survival wasn't over yet. The puppies were small, their little bodies trembling with the remnants of the cold, and Jack knew he had to act fast if they were to make it through the night. The fire crackled and popped as the wind continued to howl outside, the storm far from over. Jack could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He hadn't planned on becoming responsible for anyone, let alone a dog and her pups. He had spent so many years working alone, embracing the quiet solitude of his cabin. His days as a firefighter had left him with scars, both physical and emotional, and he had retreated from the world. But now, standing in his living room, watching the German shepherd care for her pups, Jack couldn't ignore the sense of duty that stirred within him. The shepherd's eyes followed him as he moved toward the fire, her gaze intense but calm. She was no longer trembling from the cold, but Jack could see the lingering worry in her eyes. Her focus was solely on her pups, and Jack could tell that she would do whatever it took to protect them. He understood that kind of determination. He had seen it countless times during his years on the fire line. As he knelt down beside the fire, gently placing the puppies on a thick wool blanket, Jack took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't just sit idly by. The storm was still raging outside, and they weren't safe yet. He needed to make sure they had food, warmth, and shelter for the night. He glanced over at the German shepherd, whose eyes locked with his again. There was a sense of trust there, a silent understanding that they were in this together now. Jack rose to his feet and moved toward the kitchen, his mind racing with thoughts of what he needed to do next. He wasn't sure what exactly he had gotten himself into, but he couldn't turn back now. The pups depended on him, and so did the mother. His first priority was to get them fed and settled for the night. The winter storm outside wasn't something to take lightly. It could be days before the weather calmed enough for anyone to venture outside. Jack needed to make sure they were ready for whatever came next. He pulled open the cupboard and found a tin of canned dog food. He had never been much of a pet owner, but he had kept a few supplies on hand for emergencies. He opened the can and poured the contents into a small bowl, then carried it over to where the puppies lay. The German shepherd watched him closely, her eyes filled with uncertainty but also a growing sense of trust. "You hungry?" Jack murmured as he placed the bowl in front of the pups. The smaller of the two pups sniffed at the food, but it took a moment before they both began to eat. Jack couldn't help but smile at the sight, but it was a bittersweet smile. He had no idea how long they had been outside in the storm, or how long they had been hungry. But at least now, they were safe, for the time being. The shepherd remained alert, her eyes never straying far from her pups. Jack could tell she was cautious, still assessing him. She didn't fully trust him yet, and who could blame her? She had no idea who he was or what his intentions were. But she had brought her pups to him, and that, in itself, was an act of trust. Jack moved to the fire, stoking it to ensure that it remained strong throughout the night. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. It could be hours, even days, before it passed. He needed to prepare for the long haul. He reached for his jacket and pulled it off, then began gathering blankets and towels to make sure they had everything they needed to stay warm. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about the choices that had brought him to this point. He had spent years isolating himself from the world, distancing himself from any responsibility. He had thought he was fine, content with the quiet of his cabin and the solitude of the forest. But now, as he looked down at the German shepherd and her pups, he realized that something inside him had shifted. The feeling of isolation that had plagued him for so long was fading, replaced by a sense of connection. This was not just about saving the dogs from the storm, it was about something much deeper. It was about healing, about being needed again, and about rediscovering a part of himself that had been buried under years of emotional scars. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the wooden beam that supported the ceiling. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind continued to batter against the cabin. He had made a decision, and there was no turning back. His quiet, solitary life was over. The storm had brought them to him for a reason, and he couldn't ignore that. Jack glanced back at the shepherd, who was now resting beside her pups, her body finally beginning to relax. She was still watching him, but her eyes were no longer filled with fear. There was a softness there now, a quiet acknowledgement that he had done the right thing. Jack knew that this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead for him, the shepherd, and her pups. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a retired firefighter hiding from the world. He was someone who had made a difference, even if only in the lives of these three creatures. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. As he watched the pups finish their meal and curl up beside their mother, Jack realized that he wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like such a bad thing. The storm may have brought them here, but it was Jack's choice to open the door that had made all the difference. He had a long night ahead of him, but as he sat down in his armchair by the fire, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever came next, he would face it with these new companions by his side. Jack couldn't help but marvel at the sight before him. The shepherd and her pups, huddled together by the fire, seemed to have found some measure of comfort amidst the chaos of the storm. The mother had stopped watching him so intently, her body relaxing into the warmth of the fire. The pups, though still fragile, had begun to look less fearful. They lay curled up next to her, their small forms nestled against her side. Jack could see their tiny chests rise and fall with each shallow breath, their fragile lives now tethered to this cabin, to the warmth and safety that he had given them. He rose from his chair, moving toward the window. He could hear the wind howling outside, the snow piling up higher and higher. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but it didn't matter. They were trapped here until the storm passed, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility, not just for the dogs, but for what they represented. They weren't just animals. They were survivors, just like him. They had braved the storm, fought for their lives, and now they were here, in his home. And for better or worse, they had become his responsibility. Jack stared out the window for a long while, his mind racing. He had spent so many years running away from responsibility, from connections, and from the past. But now, with these three creatures depending on him, he was forced to confront the reality of his choices. He couldn't keep hiding in his cabin forever. The world, with all its challenges and uncertainties, had a way of finding you. Maybe it was time to face it head-on. The storm outside raged on, the snow piling higher with each passing minute. Jack knew that if he was going to get through this, he needed to stay focused. He couldn't afford to let his mind wander, not when there was so much at stake. The pups needed care, food, warmth, and most of all, protection. The shepherd, too, needed reassurance that she had found a safe place, that she wasn't alone anymore. Jack walked back to the fireplace and crouched down beside the dogs. The shepherd looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but still cautious. She hadn't fully let go of her wariness, and Jack didn't blame her. Trust was earned, not freely given. He reached out, gently stroking the top of her head, careful not to startle her. She stiffened at first but soon relaxed under his touch, her eyes softening as she accepted his gesture. The pups, now slightly more energetic, began to shift restlessly on their blanket. Jack's heart went out to them. They were so young, so fragile. He reached for the bowl of food again, refilling it and placing it in front of them. The pups eagerly licked at the contents, their tiny tongues brushing against the metal, hungry for more. Jack watched them for a moment before turning to the mother. "You're doing great," he murmured softly, as if speaking directly to her. "You've made it through the worst of it, but we've still got a long road ahead. I won't let anything happen to you or your pups. I promise." He felt a deep connection with the shepherd in that moment. It was as if she understood his words, as if they shared an unspoken bond of mutual respect. They were both survivors, each with their own battles and scars. But in this cabin, in this isolated corner of the world, they were together. And together, they would face whatever challenges the storm, and life itself, had in store. The warmth of the fire grew more intense as Jack added another log, its crackling sound filling the room. The storm outside, though fierce, seemed a distant memory now, as if the cabin itself was a sanctuary from the chaos beyond the walls. Jack had no idea how long they would be stuck here, how long they would have to wait for the weather to clear, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone. He looked down at the pups, still eating, and then at the shepherd, who had settled down beside them. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought them to this point. Had they been wandering for days, looking for shelter? Had they been abandoned, left to fend for themselves in the harsh winter weather? Jack didn't know, but it didn't matter now. They were here, safe for the moment, and that was all that mattered. The cabin grew quieter as the puppies finished their meal and fell into a peaceful sleep, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. The shepherd remained alert, her eyes darting between Jack and her pups. She was still on edge, still wary of the stranger in her midst. Jack didn't rush her. Trust would come in time, he knew. For now, he would simply be there, offering whatever he could to help them through this night. He stood and walked to the door, his hand resting on the cold, weathered wood. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but Jack didn't fear it. He had faced storms before, literal ones and the ones that raged within. This was different. This wasn't just about surviving the storm. This was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was about connection, about redemption, and about finding a new purpose in life. He turned back to the shepherd and her pups, who were now peacefully sleeping. A sense of calm washed over him. He had made the right decision. This was where he was meant to be, at least for now. He had opened the door, not just to let them in from the cold, but to allow something greater into his life. And as the storm continued to rage outside, Jack knew that he was no longer just a man living in isolation. He was part of something bigger, something that would change the course of his life, and perhaps theirs, forever. The wind howled again, but this time, Jack didn't feel the isolation he had once embraced. He felt connected to the shepherd and her pups, and to something deeper within himself. The storm may have brought them together, but it was his decision to open the door that had made all the difference. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire seemed to wrap around them like a blanket. Jack stood over the German shepherd, the weight of the decision he had just made still settling into his chest. She had fallen asleep, exhausted from the storm and the terror of the past hours, and now, with the fire crackling softly, Jack took a moment to observe her. Her body was curled protectively around the two puppies, who had also finally succumbed to the safety of warmth and rest. Jack's mind raced, wondering how they had come to be in this dire situation. The German shepherd's resilience was clear. She had endured so much, and yet here she was, still holding on to life, still fighting for her pups. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for the dog. She had been a warrior in her own right, protecting her babies from the dangers of the outside world, even as the elements tried to tear them apart. Jack had often heard stories of the bond between a mother and her young, but this was something different. This was raw, unfiltered survival, the kind that could only be born from the deepest instincts of both love and desperation. As he sat there, staring at the three of them, Jack was struck by the realization that his decision to open the door had not only saved their lives, but had transformed his own life in ways he hadn't yet begun to understand. The bond between him and the dog, the pups, was almost palpable now. It was a connection that transcended species, a silent understanding that would forever bind them together. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the German shepherd stirring. Slowly, her eyes opened, and she looked up at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and weariness. Her gaze held something else too, a deep, abiding trust. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat as he met her eyes. "You're safe now," he whispered, more to reassure himself than her. The dog's ears flicked in response, but she didn't move. The puppies, nestled in her fur, shifted slightly, their tiny bodies wiggling in search of warmth. Jack gently reached over to pet the mother dog, his hand trembling as he made contact with her icy coat. The warmth of his touch seemed to comfort her, and she leaned into him, pressing her head against his palm. For a moment, Jack allowed himself to close his eyes, taking in the quiet serenity of the room. The storm outside seemed a world away, replaced by a quiet peace that Jack had never known before. He had lived alone for so long, content with the solitude that the cabin provided. But now, he realized, there was something about the presence of these animals, these living beings, that had filled a void he hadn't even known was there. He thought of the long days and nights he had spent in this very cabin, just existing. The weight of his past had always lingered in the background, but now, for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The connection between him and the German shepherd was more than just a rescue. It was a rekindling of something Jack had lost long ago. His purpose, his sense of belonging, had been restored. As he sat there in the quiet, the warmth of the fire soothing his tired muscles, Jack made a promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to ensure that these animals never had to face the horrors of the storm again. They were safe now, but he couldn't help but wonder how long they had been out there, how much the German shepherd had sacrificed to bring her pups to safety. The thought lingered in his mind, heavy with a sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a witness to their survival, he was now part of their story. Jack stood up, stretching his sore muscles as he made his way to the small kitchen area. The fire flickered behind him, casting long shadows on the walls. As he grabbed a few cans of food from the pantry, he felt a sense of urgency. The German shepherd had been through so much, and her pups were still fragile. They would need more than just warmth to recover. Jack worked quickly, preparing a simple meal for the dog. As he opened the can of wet food, the smell wafted through the air, and the German shepherd's head snapped up. Her nose twitched, and her eyes locked onto the food. Jack smiled softly to himself, his heart swelling with affection for her. "You must be starving," he murmured, placing the bowl in front of her. The dog hesitated for a moment before sniffing the food, and then, with a quiet whine, she began to eat. Her puppies stirred, their small bodies twitching in response to the sound of their mother eating, but they remained asleep, comforted by the warmth of her body. Jack watched for a moment, his heart full. He had made the right choice. The storm may have brought them together in a way he could never have predicted, but it had also given him a new sense of purpose. The bond between them was undeniable, and Jack knew that he would do anything in his power to ensure their safety and happiness. The wind outside howled like a wild animal, but the warmth of the cabin held strong against the storm's fury. Jack settled back down on the floor near the German shepherd, watching her as she devoured the food. Her coat, though still matted with frost, seemed to gain a slight luster under the firelight, her ribs less visible now that the meal was giving her strength. She ate with a fierce determination, her eyes occasionally darting to Jack, almost as if to say, "Thank you." As she finished the meal, Jack felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just the food that had nourished her, it was the safety, the security, the promise that the world outside no longer held the same dangers for her or her pups. But Jack's mind lingered on one troubling question. What had brought them to this place? He couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened to the German shepherd before she ended up at his doorstep. The harsh conditions, the snow-covered world outside, and the deep hunger that had been so evident in her eyes, it all painted a picture of survival, but one with an ominous background. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing across the room as Jack stood up again. He grabbed his jacket and pulled it tightly around himself. For a brief moment, he looked at the dog and her pups, lying peacefully in the warmth of the cabin, and a deep sense of responsibility settled over him. The snowstorm outside wasn't just a passing inconvenience, it was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly survival could turn into a struggle. Jack stepped to the door, peering through the frosted glass. The storm had not let up. The snow still piled high against the door, and the world outside seemed like a ghostly, desolate place. But it was a place that had nearly claimed the lives of these animals. His thoughts turned to the possible fate of the German shepherd's owner. Could she have escaped? Had she been abandoned? Jack had no answers, but the way the dog had acted when he opened the door, so full of need, so full of trust, spoke volumes. Whoever had been in charge of her had either failed her or perhaps been overwhelmed by circumstances. Jack couldn't know for sure, but it no longer mattered. She and her pups were here now, and that's what was important. He turned back to them, and something in his heart stirred. He hadn't expected his life to change so dramatically tonight, and he hadn't anticipated how deeply he would feel the weight of this unexpected responsibility. He glanced down at the German shepherd, still lying next to her pups. Her eyes were closed, but Jack could see her muscles twitching, the faintest tremble passing through her body. She wasn't completely out of danger yet. She needed rest, and so did her pups. But the thought of their future remained heavy in Jack's mind. This was a pivotal moment for him, a chance to make a difference, a chance to heal the scars of his own past. As Jack moved to tend to the fire, adding a few more logs to keep the heat steady, his thoughts returned to the outside world. He had no idea how long the storm would last, but he knew one thing for sure: the bond between him and these animals was already unbreakable. The German shepherd's body remained curled tightly around her pups, protecting them even as they slept soundly. Jack could see her sides rise and fall in rhythmic motion. Despite everything, she was a warrior at heart. And her pups, though young and fragile, were survivors too. Their tiny bodies had already been tested by the harshness of nature. But they were safe now. And they would stay safe. Jack grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it over the family. As the warmth of the fire enveloped them all, he felt a strange peace settle in his chest. He may not have known what tomorrow would bring, but in this moment, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The storm continued its fury outside, the winds battering against the walls of the cabin. But inside, Jack felt something profound. It was the quiet calm that comes with knowing you've made a choice that transcends mere survival. He hadn't just opened a door to let in animals. He had opened a door to his own heart. And in doing so, he had found something far more precious than mere shelter. These animals had chosen him, just as much as he had chosen them. As the night wore on, Jack sat by the fire, watching over them. His thoughts wandered back to his days as a firefighter, to the moments when he had been responsible for saving lives, guiding people through dangerous situations. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being able to endure hardship. But now, in this quiet cabin, surrounded by these animals, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: humility. He was not the strong man he once thought he was. No, the strength now resided in the German shepherd, in her perseverance, her sacrifice. Her unwavering devotion to her pups was a testament to a power that transcended human understanding. And Jack could see that power now, in her, in the stillness of the cabin. It wasn't brute force or muscle. It was something gentler, more resilient, more enduring. The German shepherd stirred again, and Jack leaned forward, watching her closely. Her eyes opened, and for a brief moment, they locked onto his. Her gaze was steady, calm, but full of gratitude. And Jack, feeling the weight of her trust in him, smiled softly. This was their moment. No words were necessary. They were bound together by a silent promise, one that would not be broken. As the fire crackled and the snowstorm raged on outside, Jack knew that he had just begun a new chapter of his life. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it would be a journey he would face with the strength and courage of those who depended on him, the German shepherd and her pups.